Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this very special lecture, the final Insight Series lecture of this semester. I invite all of you here who are there in person as well as the Zoom people who have been joining us. Today we are here to discuss about a very important topic. I think one of the most front-runner political topics that I feel that is in engaging with this country. And I couldn't think of a better person than Professor Satish Deshpande to come and talk about this issue with us. He is someone who has engaged with this topic for the last 2 decades, and I feel that given his expertise and given his work in this area, I think it is our benefit that we get to hear from him. So the title of the talk that we came upon and after discussion was Essential Yet Inadequate: Caste Census as a Tool for the Goal of Social Justice in 21st Century India. I'll give a brief abstract for the talk, after which Anushka will introduce the speaker. So the abstract goes as follows. After nearly 3 decades of mostly uninformed controversy and prejudice debate, India seems to be finally opting for a caste census. What does this mean exactly? What consequences will it have, both intended as far as we can know them, as well as the unintended ones? In particular, is the caste census a guarantee of social justice, or at least more of it than we can currently have? This presentation will explore these and related questions against the backdrop of the following additional questions that are crucial for finding robust and socially useful answers to the first set. Number one, what is the census and what does it do according to scholars? Number two, what are the powerful but latent ideological shifts that shape our understanding of the relationship between demographic numbers and political power? And number three, what happens and what should happen when the social reality that is now known as intersectionality meets the various social movements that are struggling for that elusive destination that we call as social justice? That being said, I request Anushka to give a brief introduction about the speaker.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the final Insight Series lecture of this semester, hosted by the Humanities and Social Sciences Department at IIT Ahmedabad. The Insight Series lectures began in 2022 by Professor Ashish Deshpande with a focus on development and indigenous peoples issues. Previous luminaries who have raised the lecture include P. Simon, Professor Rashid Khalili, Professor Mahmoud Mandani, and Professor Edgar Mansour. Today, we are very fortunate to have with us Professor Satish Deshpande for a very critical talk. Trained in the disciplines of economics and sociology from the Jawaharlal Nehru University and the University of California, Professor Satish Deshpande retired from the Department of Sociology at the Delhi School of Economics, Delhi University, and is currently M. N. Srinivas Chair Visiting Professor at the Institute for Social and Economic Change, Bengaluru. He has taught economics at St. Stephen's College, Delhi, has been on the faculty of the Institute of Economic Growth, Delhi, and the University of Hyderabad, and has held visiting appointments at the University of Chicago, the University of California, and the School for Advanced Studies in Social Sciences at Paris. He is the author of Contemporary India, a Sociological View, co-author of Untouchability in Rural India, editor of The Problem of Caste, and the co-editor of Sectarian Violence in India, Hindu-Muslim Conflict from 1966 to 2015, Beyond Inclusion, the Practice of Equal Access in Indian Higher Education, and Anthropology in the East, Founders of Indian Sociology and Social Anthropology. He has been involved with the writing of school textbooks and examinations at the NCERT and CBSE, and was a member of the designing committee of the Equal Opportunity Commission by the Government of India. He is the recipient of the 2012 Mancom Asia Award for Distinguished Contributions to Development Studies. His areas of interest include caste and class inequalities, the theory and practice of social justice, the history and politics of the social sciences and higher education, especially social science pedagogy and questions of language. Please join me in welcoming Professor Satish Deshpande to IIT Nagpur today.
Before we begin, I would like to hand over a small token of appreciation to Professor Satish. So from IIT Nagpur, thank you, sir. Thank you.
So I'm very happy and grateful for the invitation to be here. These days, no invitation can be taken for granted. So I'm very happy to be pleased to be able to speak to you about the subject that I have been working on and so on, and which, for various reasons, seems to be in the news again lately. I cannot help but recount to you that I have been working on this and essentially asking for, not just me, but a group of others as well, since 1998. Many of you would probably have been born very recently when that, at that year. But since then, this is the first time that it looks like there is sufficient momentum to actually produce a decision in favor of a caste census. What I would like to do is, it's a very simple framework. You've seen the title already. So I recently run through a very obvious set of questions. Why do I claim that it is essential for social justice, a census? And then why do I also claim that it is at the same time inadequate? In answering what I call as the first order questions, we will come up with issues, deeper issues, that need to be thought about differently and with a less than immediate focus. They are also much more complex than simply the issue of counting castes. So we will spend most of the time on those second order issues because I think those are the real challenges. And especially as students of social science, those are the issues that should be concerning us. Not that the first set of issues don't concern us, but the complications lie in the second order questions, and I will try and spend most of my time on those issues. So why is it essential? The most practical reason why it's essential is because a census trumps all sample surveys. There is no shortage of data on caste. We have a lot of sample survey-based data on caste. But with sample surveys, there is always the issue of the sample size. In a country as vast and as diverse as India, sample surveys pose formidable challenges. Even though, of course, at the same time, it is true that India was one of the pioneers in the technology of sample surveys. And it has a very high reputation, or at least used to have a very high reputation in the world of sample surveys. Nevertheless, a sample survey is a limited exercise compared to a census. So a census will yield more authoritative data, more comprehensive data that will be very much harder to contradict. At the same time, the census enjoys, this is the dream of all social scientists, right? Especially if you do survey work, in your dreams, sometimes you think of doing a survey where you can tell your respondents, if you don't respond to this, you will go to jail. Now, we can't say that in most surveys, but with the census, that is actually true. The Census Act of 1948 makes it a crime not to respond to a census enumerator. It makes it a crime also for the officials to disclose the census data, etc., etc. So essentially, it is backed by the full might of the state and compels an answer from everyone. We don't have the equivalent anywhere else. Even in the NSS, all our surveys are self-reported data, and it is open to a respondent to say, no, I do not wish to participate. In fact, if you follow NSS surveys, you will see there are replacement. The sampling is done in such a way that replacement households are already pre-selected in case this happens. So these are the functional reasons why it is comprehensive, it is authoritative, it is backed by law. But the reason that I have been advocating, the main reason why I have been advocating is a different one. It is, if one might call it, a combination of an ideological reason and an ethical reason. In my other work, I've been talking about what I call the hypervisibility of certain castes in Indian society and the relative invisibility of certain other castes. To put it bluntly, the upper castes, like most privileged people, or like every privileged end of a power spectrum, enjoy the right or the ability to control their visibility. So rich people, powerful people can control how and to what extent they are visible to the rest of us. Those who are at the other end of the power spectrum, those who are powerless, they cannot control their visibility. Their visibility is an imposed visibility, it's a mandatory visibility. So the visibility of women, for example, compared to men, the visibility of the poor, ever since the welfare state was invented, the poor have been relentlessly studied. And even today, more than 95%, maybe the figure is even higher, I'm simply throwing out the figure, of all social science research is done on people who are of lower social status than the researcher. Because we rely, like anthropology did in the bad old days, rely on the privileges of race, class, urban origin, etc., in order to preempt the question of the informed consent of the respondent. Technically, we are meant to take informed consent, but these power angles, these power relations preempt the question. So, with caste, when used by middle class, upper caste people, particularly when used in the context of subjects like reservation, caste actually comes to mean lower caste. And the upper castes become invisible, or they can control their visibility. They are not actually invisible. When they wish to be visible, there is many concept of visibility. So we need to counter this. And I think the census is an excellent way of countering that. Otherwise, we have this framework where the lower caste means lower castes, and the lower castes are supplicants. They are begging for state support. Whereas the so-called general category, again, a misnomer, I'll speak a few words about the word general as well. Whereas the upper castes are meritocratic people who don't depend on the state and so on. This is simply not true. The privileged from certain individuals from this state downwards to more petty forms of privilege are all clearly and in a way that you can assemble evidence for, driven by the state, helped by the state. So everybody is taking help from the state. Some kinds of help are visible, or rather hyper-visible, and the subject of endless debate and controversy. Some other kinds are described in other ways and are not subject to controversy. So to end this asymmetry in caste, it would be an excellent idea, in my opinion, if everyone were asked in the form of a census questionnaire, what is your caste? You retain the right to say, I have no caste and so on. In fact, there was a movement on this around one of the censuses. Meri Jati Hindustani, you may have heard of that. But still, you have to answer the question. And this act of every single citizen of this country having to answer what their caste is, I think, a step forward from the unspoken asymmetry on caste that rules today. So the starting point to solve problems of caste inequality is when we start accepting that everyone has caste. Otherwise, we are locked in the frame of some castes, read lower castes, are always dependent on state help, whereas other castes are meritocratic and so on, which is, as I tried to tell you, simply not true. So it would be an excellent idea, in my opinion, and as a step forward, only a step. It's not going to solve anything on its own if there were to be a caste census. But this is not a functional reason. It has to do with ideology surrounding caste, and it has to do with the ethics of caste, I believe. So if these are the reasons why I believe it is essential, why do I say it's inadequate? The main reason is that a caste census, if it were to happen tomorrow, is not going to have any major surprises for us. The Bihar Caste survey, I must remember not to call it a census, legally it was called a survey. Because of the Census of India Act, only the central government is empowered to conduct something called a census. State governments are not empowered. Therefore, when the Karnataka government or the Bihar government conducts such a census, it is called by some other name. And the Bihar survey is called a survey. Yeah. But it is in effect a census. Has not yielded any major surprises. We already know that the privileged are few, and at least since the 1990s, since Mandal, we have known that, publicly known, as a social scientific fact, this has been known for even longer, right? But as part of public common sense, we know, at least since the 1990s, that these so-called upper castes are a minority. And yet, nothing much has changed in terms of the power relations of castes. So in short, the census is not going to tell us anything drastically new. So if we already know that power structure is this way, why hasn't something been done about it? So in other words, I'm turning the argument around. The point is not the availability of data. What has stopped the redressal of caste inequalities is not the lack of data. It is the lack of political will, as the old phrase goes. So by itself, a caste census will not solve anything. And it will still require political will in order to solve this, address these problems. The second reason why this is inadequate, I believe, is that we need to the functional framework of a caste census and its relationship to welfare is very, very rigid, and it erases other possible questions. I believe that today the caste question is a question about our democracy. It is not a question of welfare alone. In fact, the welfare part of it is, in my opinion, a relatively smaller part of the question than the democracy part. So if what we are really talking about is democracy, and the future of our democracy is in some way related to a caste census, then simply doing a caste census alone is not enough. And the fundamental reason, what I'm building up to really, is that in that old cliche, the numbers never speak for themselves. They have to, this is something I tell students in methods classes. When you're looking at a statistical table, start with this counterintuitive rule. Words are more important than numbers. This sounds counterintuitive because the statistical table is all about numbers, but numbers by themselves cannot carry meaning. Words must be attached to numbers for the numbers to carry meaning. And as soon as you enter the world of words and the world of meaning, you enter the world, whether you like it or not, you enter the world of ideology, you enter the world of cultural power relations. If the numbers do not speak for themselves, then simply doing a caste census by itself will not be enough. So to understand why this is not enough, we need to move to the second order questions, and I will try and do that quickly so that we have enough time for questions and answers. The census is the sort of topic that everybody thinks they know what it means. And when you actually try to find out what people have in their mind, it turns out they have different things in their mind when you start asking about it. It's like middle class, right? Everybody thinks they know middle classes. In fact, everybody thinks they belong to the middle class. But it's like that old Garrison Taylor, punchline and the tagline that he had for his program called the Prairie Home Companion, where the men are good looking. This fictional town that is in Minnesota that he spoke about. This is a radio program in the United States. This dates me very much, but it doesn't matter. Where the tagline was, where the men are good looking, the women are strong, and the children are all above average. So I use the last part. Everyone being above average. It's statistically impossible. It can't be that. But we often believe in such things. So let me talk now about what people have in mind when they think of the census. So one, or what I'm calling here somewhat grandiosely as models of the census. Some people think, particularly upper caste people, middle class people, think of the census as though it were actually a kind of welfare program. That just doing the census will magically produce welfare, like Manrega, or Jawahar Awas Yojana, or name any kind of other welfare program. The census is kind of a glorified version of that it will automatically produce some kind of welfare. Others think of the census as, and there's a lot of literature on this, as a machine or a device or an instrument that fixes identities. We have heard a lot about a decade ago, or about 2 decades, since 1980s, about compulsory identities. And census as a giant mechanism for producing compulsory identities. So some people think of it like that. Other people, particularly academics, tend to think of the census as though it were a research program that would produce the truth about something. In this case, it would produce the truth about caste. But I like to think of the census as also two other things which are not normally talked about. The census is also, and this an inkling of this, a kind of abhas, a sense of it, if you like, is there in the public imagination. The census is also a kind of selfie of the nation. This is the selfie age, as you know, and everybody understands what a selfie is, the concept of a selfie. A selfie is about yourself, right? And it's about yourself in a particular context. So this is the nation taking a selfie of itself. I mean, if you imagine that. So a census is like a collective portrait of the nation. A self-portrait, if you like. Because what is the content of the census? The content of the census is the answers you gave to the census enumerator, the answers I gave, the answers 3 other people gave, etc., etc. It's all our answers aggregated that produces this collective self. And that has important ideological functions. By the way, I suppose by now your generation should be used to it. In case it's not, ideology is not a bad word, right? It's not used for other people alone, an ideology is a social mechanism. And then it's, everybody has ideologies. It's not possible to live outside ideologies. Just like it's not possible to live outside society. Even when you live in a commune, you're relating to society in a particular way by rejecting that society, etc. So a selfie, and related to that as a kind of referendum, if you like, where people give their opinions on what they think like caste is. We don't really have to think of the census as producing the truth about caste is mistaken. There are reasons for this that I can't get into in detail now. I'll be happy to answer questions. But even if we think of it as a referendum, all our sample surveys are in a sense referendums because they are all respondent driven. They are whatever the respondent tells you is the case. So it's more useful to my mind to think of the census. Not that the first three are wrong. There are elements of truth in them, but not enough for them to be what we rely on, what we place weight on. Alongside this, many different people also have very different ideas about what caste is. I will very quickly run through that, models of caste. One, I've already mentioned one, where caste actually means lower caste. You yourself don't have caste, but caste means those people out there who have caste. Caste is also thought of, particularly in social scientific literature, social anthropological literature in particular, as a meaning-giving institution in Indian society. That social life is regulated by caste, and it's an institution that invests everyday life with meanings. Others, particularly those of the Marxist bent, think of caste as a mechanism for managing relations of distribution, as well as relations of production, but yes, relations of distribution as well. So how will production be organized? Who will get what share from the output or the results of production? This is regulated by caste. And finally, some people see it as an obstacle to modernity. It's something that is keeping us behind there. So I must confess that this last view has lost a lot of ground, and I don't think people talk about this as much and as emphatically as they used to before, because everybody is now talking about caste. This wasn't true just 20 years ago. If you spoke outside of very narrow disciplinary circles on a subject like caste, people had the faint, you got the faint sense that people thought, I thought you knew better. That why are you talking about this kind of thing? There was that, the leftover of the Nehruvian embarrassment about caste. But suddenly today that is gone. And I see that there's a lot of talk about caste going on. So maybe that is not obstacle to modernity. Caste is definitely part of our contemporary life. And our contemporary life is in no way not modern. We are not going to accept that contemporary India is not modern. So if caste is part of contemporary India, it's got to be part of modernity as well. So that example has. There's a way in which you can mix and match these models of the census and models of caste to work out what ideas about what the census might produce, a caste census, bringing those two together might produce. You can work out a kind of a taxonomy of that. And that sort of thing is useful for a class. I won't get into the details here. There's also, at this stage, different standpoints. This is already, in a sense, implicit in what I've already said about models. After all, models are drawn up from particular standpoints. So caste can be seen from the standpoint of the state. And even in terms of the state, there are two phases of the state, if you like. The developmental phase of the state, the developmental state, and the political state. The state that controls power, the state that controls the developmental apparatus. Both these views of the state offer particular points of view and have an elective affinity with different kinds of models of both caste and census. So we can think about those things. Just so that nobody's lost. What am I trying to do? I started by saying why I think a caste census is essential for social justice and also why it is inadequate. But to understand the reasons why it is essential and inadequate, we need to understand other things. And it's these other things that we're talking about, these second order things. That's what we're doing. So, these are the two views of the state. There's this point of view, obvious point of view of social science, and I will say something more about that in the context of the Bihar census towards the end as an example. Obviously, there's the standpoint of the social groups themselves. A particular caste group would have a standpoint from where to look at census data on caste if they were to do caste census. And finally, an elusive sort of view from nowhere type of standpoint, the standpoint of social justice. Because it matters who's talking about social justice. Right? On the one hand, as they say, talk is cheap, so anyone can talk about social justice. But the standpoint from where you talk about social justice becomes important. And it is not necessarily true that social justice can only be seen from X1 standpoint or Y standpoint. And it's an interesting set of issues to look at as to what the standpoint of social justice might be. So these are simply, I'm just simply offering you a bare taxonomy of the second order elements that might be involved without going into any of them, developing any of them in any detail. What I want to spend some time though is something very important and something on which I have been thinking about lately, and I would like your views on that as well, is the whole question of the relationship between number and power. Ultimately, that's what a census is. In a context such as our context, a census, particularly a caste census, is about the relationship between number and power. And this relates to what I was saying earlier, that the numbers don't speak for themselves. They have to be, meaning has to be allotted to them, allocated to them. And this is contested terrain, right? What meaning can numbers carry? And here I want to talk about two major paradigms, models, whatever you want to call it, of the relationship between number and power. And these relate to two of the most sacred institutions in our country. And this is a question I've been asking. I've been giving talks around this area since the Bihar Caste Census happened. And there was more interest on this, and I asked this everywhere, and it's interesting to see what people say. What do you think is the most sacred institution in India today? And big hint, it's not the cow. What do you think? Supreme Court, yes, that's a very popular answer. Many people say Supreme Court. Many people say Constitution. Some people say democracy and so on. But to cut a long story short, once I tell you what it is, I'm sure you will agree. The most sacred institution in India is the examination. We believe in examinations, right? People are labeled on the basis of examination. They are labeled for life, right? And the other institution, of course, is the election. Right? Again, well, calling elections sacred is a bit sort of stretching it these days, but it's still a very important, a very critical institution. So these two institutions, central to our social life, offer radically different models of the relationship between number and power. To put it a little more abstractly or philosophically, it's always a good idea to encourage people to try to do something philosophical, or say at least that you're trying to do something philosophical, is about the relationship between manyness and goodness. Manyness is about number, and goodness is about something being right, something being appropriate. So the election is the model where the many are the good, right? Because majority rule. Majority rule is seen as democratic because in the modern era, after the basis of legitimate power shifted from the authority of kings, the arbitrary or divine authority of kings and queens and so on, to the people, the instrument we use to measure the will of the people is the election. And in one form or the other, a majority. This can be quite complicated. I mean, an enormous amount of coverage we have seen, more perhaps than on our Indian elections, on the American elections recently. And you will know all about it. You'll be an expert by now on the electoral college, how complex the actual construction of American democracy is, and actually how undemocratic it is in its own way. But anyway, that's an aside. But in the model of the election, the many are invested with legitimacy, with authority, and therefore they reform in what I am calling their part of the good. The few are, not that they are bad, but the few are, it is legitimate and appropriate and fitting that the few lose the election and therefore don't have an access to legitimate power. So the route to legitimate power via the model of the election implies the model of goodness aligned with benefits. And here, the underlying presumption is that all citizens are equal. There's an interesting paradox here that maybe you should think about. I won't develop it right now. But even though all citizens are equal, depending on how you vote and who you voted for, you might end up on the losing side. So you voted for the side that lost the election, then your side or your opinion doesn't get reflected in power. Nevertheless, you and the person who voted for the majority side are still equal. Right? This is the underlying model of the census. I'm sorry, of the election. Think of the model of the examination. What is the model of the examination? The examination is about, as we are fond of saying, measuring excellence. Now, excellence is about the few. Almost by definition, it's about the few. The idea of a topper, which is a sacred idea in India, you never forget whenever you're a topper. There might have been like 3 people in the class, and you got 2 marks more than the other 2 people, but you're still a topper, and you're a topper for the rest of your life. So, how many toppers can there be? Like, relative to the number of people who take the exam, there have to be few, right? So, excellence is tied to the idea of few. One of the most formidable challenges to contemporary thought is to think of the many as excellent. Try it. Try it. It's very hard. It's very hard. And what is the presumption of the examination? The presumption of the examination, again, you will be startled at this, but reflect on it, and I think we come to agree. The presumption of the examination is that the candidates are unequal. They have differing abilities, they are unequal, and the job of the examination is to discover those inequalities, right? To convert them into a measurable form. So an examination is a device to measure inequality. In fact, it is a device to produce inequality. Think of an examination in which everybody gets 100 on 100. What's going to happen? Everybody knows, right? The first thing will happen is there will be headlines about paper leakage. The exam will be cancelled, it will be held again. Right? So we cannot digest the idea of everybody being good. Right? And the idea of excellence is built on fewness, monopolizing the good. And yet, this is the basis. These 2 models are contrasting in themselves, in their presuppositions, in how they work, and so on. And yet, these are the foundations of the 2 main pillars that prop up modernity: democracy and meritocracy. How does modernity distinguish itself from the pre-modern? These 2 institutions are a big part of the answer. And they are built on radically different models of the relationship between number and power. Why am I getting into all this? I'm getting into all this to show you that the relationship between number and value is not automatic. It is not that the many are always good. No. Sometimes the many are objects of pity, objects of ridicule. Right? That's why the sociological conception of a minority is not a numerical concept. In sociology, minority is not a numerical concept. It has a concept that has to do with power, has to do with status. And that's why you have the parallel concept of the elite. Both the elite and the minority are few, but there's very different kinds of fewness, right? The elite are few and powerful, more or less because they are few. Or at least we can agree that they are both powerful and few. Whereas at the other end, the masses are many and powerless. And again, this is seen as a legitimate equation. So meritocracy and elections control the access to legitimate power. You all know what the Bavarian definition and so on, so I'm not going to talk about that, where the difference between raw power and authority is legitimacy, right? And legitimacy is channeled to these major institutions of how the relationship between number and power is regulated. Finally, let me come to questions of intersectionality and differentiation and how this might have to do with social groups. Everybody again now is so much talked about that I think everybody knows the term intersectionality. Or rather, to be more accurate, everybody must be using the term intersectionality, whether or not you're confident about what it actually means. Or at the very least, it's a word that you know you ought to know, right? Where you will not easily admit to not knowing what it is. You quickly might look it up later on the phone, turning the other side and so on, but you're not going to say, I don't know what is intersectionality and so on. So one of the most difficult issues to come up, especially in the context of a caste census, is the question of intersectionality. Now, the ways in which intersectionality has been conducted is very complex, full of problems. I won't get into all that. But at the surface level, what is happening is that intersectionality is proving to be a major, how shall I put it, from one point of view, a major nuisance. It's a nuisance because categories that were constructed as homogeneous and depended for their political salience and their political weight on everybody agreeing to accept that they were homogeneous. This homogeneity is now being splintered by ideas of intersectionality. And if this homogeneity is splintered, so is the authority of the group, or the claim to ethical claims or political claims of the group are also splintered because of intersectionality. So intersectionality is like development, right? Not always a happy thing, right? Bad things can happen as part of, at least setbacks can happen as part of something called intersectionality. So we are beginning to now become sensitized to groups within groups. The classic all-time ideological favorite of the poor upper caste person. This is a reigning concept, reigning not in the sense of water political style, but in the sense of ruling. A ruling concept for a very long time. My childhood is full of stories. I was told stories about once upon a time in a play, something, there was a poor Brahmin. It's a favorite way in which stories are played. What is this? It's an intersectional category, right? You're intersecting Brahmin, upper caste, whatever, with poverty, being poor. In the same way now, all the talk of creamy layer exclusion is about intersection. Yeah. You're the privileged among the lower caste. Again, a very favorite, ideologically very, very popular trope or model. Right? These are the sorts of issues that a proper census, caste census, will inevitably throw up. And this will throw up all kinds of problems and challenges that will have to be faced, that cannot be avoided. Once again, it's not as though some breathtakingly new revelation is going to happen with the caste census. We already have an inkling of what intersectionality might look like, but they will be brought to the fore once again. So, in short, what am I saying? I'm saying that when we think about the caste census or a possible caste census and what could be the relationship between it and a caste census and social justice? We need to understand, first of all, that there is no automatic relationship. Nevertheless, think of the opposite. Think of there is endless talk of the politics of counting caste. We never talk about the politics of not counting caste. It's not as though not counting caste is politically neutral, that it has no politics. There is a politics associated with not counting caste as well. So if we think in these ways, we need to understand that we cannot avoid the caste census. If you want to move ahead to address questions of social justice, we cannot address questions of social justice in the overall, or as we would say, goal terms that we were doing before. You know, the aggregate terms that we for groups. And this is, to my mind, a step forward. The only way out of caste is to pass through it. There's no like flyover or bypass or so on that can take you, from your caste-soaked present to a casteless future. There's no magic bullet. There's no magic carpet that will take you there. So you have to get more and more involved in caste. And caste there has to be a sort of reductio ad absurdum caste. Right? You have to pay so much attention, start paying attention to caste, that you keep breaking it down into its constituents until finally you reach a stage where people realize it doesn't matter. There are lots of other issues. Caste alone is not solving any problem. But we are very, very far from that day. Caste still marks large segments. It still marks the extremities of our social and economic system. So while we are very far from that, we have to recognize that what is going on when a caste census is going on. These sorts of issues, the sorts of issues I have talked about in the second part, are what are in the background of the kinds of controversies that the caste census will create. Now, all this has been very abstract, and to take you to a more concrete thing, I will just show you some snippets from the Bihar caste survey, and we'll spend a few minutes on that before I end. This is, I'm sorry that I've not been able to convert the Hindi font, but I'm sure we'll be able to read. The Bihar caste survey provided, the way in which the data have been offered is in terms of large groupings, like the upper caste or Samanya, general category as it's called there, the other backward classes, the extremely backward classes, the scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, and a residual category of others. So data is given for education, for type of house, for what I'm showing you here is one of the assets, that is a computer with internet. And for those of you who are really into social science, it is a very, very fascinating exercise to do. You can just do it on Excel. You can try to first. There's a lot of drudge work involved, and I'm very grateful for a colleague of mine who had research assistants who helped do the drudge work, because what has been released, the Bihar caste census, let me say a few words about it before I go on. The Bihar caste census is historic for one reason and one reason only, and that is that it is the only caste census or caste survey to actually be published and made public, to become available. That's the one reason why it is historical. Up to now, these kinds of exercises have been done, but they're not being released. The most prominent case is Karnataka, which did a very comprehensive survey in 2017, but till today, the results are secret. They are not released to the public. On the other hand, the last survey that was done in Bihar has been released in a very limited, truncated form. It's very hard for researchers to work with it. And it is not transparent in the way that the census is transparent, the NSS surveys are transparent, and so on. So how we go about the method has not been clarified. Unit level data is not available to researchers to do different kinds of crosstabs and so on. So in short, there is a lot of lack of transparency in terms of how data collection went on. This is not necessarily something sinister or something like that, but it's bad practice as far as surveys are concerned, because especially state surveys, where it's backed by the power of the state, you expect transparency, methodological transparency. So all that is not there, and aggregate data are presented on these categories. So what you have to, and the released report, if you really have connections with the current Bihar government, you can try getting more than I could, but I could only contact the Rajya and what he got me was this PDF file. That's the one that all my colleagues have. Whoever has worked on this has a PDF file. Now, everybody knows, particularly those who work with data, know that PDF is the bane of our lives. Right? Because we cannot, and especially if it doesn't allow you to easy conversion to a spreadsheet. So you have to go through the tedium of re-entering all the data in a spreadsheet. Right? And then you can produce something like this. And I don't want to take the credit. I didn't do all the Raj work. Somebody else has done it. And I'm taking advantage of this. So when you put all the tasks together, you are able to, what the Bihar Census offers us is the proportion of those, for example, the proportion of those with computers with internet in X caste, Y caste, and so on, right? It does not tell you, that is to say, what proportion of the members of that caste own this particular resource. That is what the Bihar Caste tells you. It does not tell you what proportion members of owners of that resource of that caste form of all owners of that resource. Right? That's the other way to do it. So to do that, you have to do all this data entry business, which is what I have done, and then you can get these kinds of numbers. And it's a very fascinating exercise to take any of these assets, and it's remarkable how the 1, 2, 3 positions are always retained by the same class. So you first put all the data together, that is to say, you put the numbers about how many people own a computer with internet in caste X, caste Y, etc., all the castes. Then you can add up all those numbers to get the total number of persons with computers with internet. And then you can calculate percentages. Caste X owners of computers with internet, what proportion do they form of all owners of computers with internet, and so on, right? So if you do that and then you sort the file, you arrange by, say, the number. I've used the filter. You can see. So those are conditions. The conditions I took, how many conditions I used were: population of the caste must be more than 1 lakh. That is a reasonable expectation to have at the state level. The number of people with whatever resource, in this case, computer with internet, should be more than 10,000. And the proportion of caste owners of that resource as a percentage of all owners should be 3%. If you use those conditions and do a filter and order by the number of such persons, that is by column 5, you will produce this ordering of castes. So by doing this kind of thing, you can see, for example, that Banyas, although they are classified as OBCs, by the way, I've cut out some castes have many synonyms, and it makes the column very wide, so I've cut out synonyms. So, for example, there is a strong case. I'm jumping steps, but to get to the point is that there may be a strong case for Banyas being not part of the OBC because they seem in markers that in terms of practical levels very well off. Lots of different kinds of inter-caste differences as well as intra-caste differences can come out once you start analyzing the data. What we don't have, the most important thing that we don't have from the Caste Census is access to unit level data. So we can't tell how many people have a computer with internet, also have a 4-wheel vehicle, also have a house with more than 4 rooms, etc., etc. We cannot then construct a proxy for a class because we don't have the unit level data. We only have aggregate. Anyway, but even with this, a lot is possible. In concrete terms, this is the kind of work you can do as a social scientist with caste census data. Now, the political implications of this are, some of them are quite obvious, some might not be so obvious. I won't speak about those. I'll stop now. Because we have, I think, I've already overshot my time. So let me end with this thing once again, little cryptic. The caste census is ultimately about the relationship between numbers and power. This relationship, or rather, the ways in which our society has organized this relationship between number and power, is facing a crisis today. The short way of putting this crisis is that our democracies, not just in India, the world over, our democracies are becoming electocracies. And our meritocracies are becoming examocracies. So the consensual way in which the relationship between number and power has been organized is in crisis today. We need to rethink this relationship, and we need to rethink in what context is manyness going to be associated with goodness? In what context are we going to refuse to associate with goodness? The obvious danger here is majoritarianism of various kinds. Now, one kind of majoritarianism, very obvious kind of majoritarianism, many countries in the world, including our own, have become conscious of recently. But remember, there can be other kinds of majoritarianism as well. And the caste census will open the door to other kinds of majoritarianism as well. This doesn't mean that therefore we shouldn't do the caste census, right? So in short, the caste census in the short run may increase our problems, but it is a step that is a necessary first step, without which we cannot proceed further in the journey towards social justice. I'll stop there.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Satish, for that really wonderful, I think, a very sweeping analysis of why the caste census is required. I'm cognizant of time, and I know that a lot of you have to leave for physical education. But before we do that, if there are any burning questions and if there are any urgent questions, we'll first have the questions from the audience here, and then we can go to the audience who are there on Zoom. So if there are any questions here, then we'll be happy to take them right now. So,
by the way, don't circulate this data. Nowadays, you have to assume that things will get recorded because it needs more work, right? Before you start making claims and so on. Apart from simply showing what I told you as an example, the kinds of things you can do, but it needs more careful work before it can be put out.
Okay. Can someone help to?
That's what I've done very elaborate on the coordinates of the word coordinates and the word task. work class, working class. The word well. You, when you make census based on class, there has to be some kind of clarity about the word. No matter how it's translated. Articles have written an article where he talks about 16 different meanings of the word class. Now, how do you solve this?
Yes.
This issue? I think that how do you figure out this longitudinal study of class-based studies? If we wish to do that, when we have a new series of appearances and disappearances of class in different census years, then either because of shifting identities or because of migration. In fact, there was a place in Mysore where we spent some time. The village had about 4.1% Brahmins at some point of time. And when we went there, the Brahmin population had come down to zero. It didn't mean that they were decimated. They had all moved to the urban center of Mysore. So, how do you take care of these kind of issues where there is total disappearance of caste or reappearance of caste in certain identities? Thank you.
We collect 2 or 3 questions. No, I thought we collect 2 or 3 questions. That is same time. Otherwise,
All right. Well, I thought it was a fantastic talk. So very nice way. At the end, it was really questioning the goodness of the democratic model as a way to bring about a sort of free, just kind of society. That's my experience. And the other day I was found the house and this great poster of Gandhi's period of democracy. And he basically said, I'm just voting for Western democracy, you could say Indian democracy, is basically functioning like diluted fat.
why?
Diluted fat.
Diluted.
So I'm curious if your thoughts on saying like that.
Yeah, not so diluted sometimes.
Hi, thank you so much. So I would like to, so when we're talking about democracy and one of the things that one of the organizations usually democracy and meritocracy. So one of the things that we see the organizing or anything of the safety reservations in institutes when it comes to democracy students. And while I was reading about we have were very excited about it, it's not that around 60% of the OBCs and the UPs and around 10% the forward Brahmins, fat and those people. But still, if we consider around 10%, if they only 5% are technology backward, they still have or still left with around 10% situation. And when it comes to the OBCs, 50% and 27%. So my question is regarding the rhetoric that is maybe everywhere the OBCs are taking over. Whenever there is there's considerable representation of OBC somewhere, considerably deviation. So how do you have to kind of happen to
Okay, so we'll take this set of 3 and I'll try and be brief. Professor Subha, multiple meanings, yes, but this is a problem that the census deals with routinely. The most complex data that the census collects is the data on occupation. There are literally thousands of occupations, and yet this data can be processed and made useful. It is not easy. It's a probably difficult task, but it is definitely not impossible. And yes, how many religions do you think are returned in the census? That is to say, how many religions get people say how many religions belong to count of those names? How many do they amount to? Can you take a guess? Then how languages? 17 or 18,000 languages. Right? Now, these are all through a process. They are processed and they are made usable. There are controversies. But as long as this process, especially technology now affords us this reversible aggregation. So you can act before with paper. Once an aggregate was produced, redoing that aggregate was nearly impossible because you need to literally millions of pieces of paper would need to be unearthed. With digital ways of doing this, you have reversible aggregation. So if you make a mistake or opinions change and you feel that text should be added with 3 instead of 4, it can be done. So partly because of technology and partly because of the superb expertise in the census. No other organization can do it. The huge mess with the socio-economic and caste census in 2011 was because it was given to the Rural Development Department, which had no expertise in doing this. So very difficult, will not end controversies, but that has been true of so much of census data. So I think that it can be done and it can be done usefully despite the challenges. That's my short answer to that. The other question about caste disappearing, I would treat that as a finding. I don't see that as a problem in the sense that if X caste has disappeared, it is the act of counting that has produced this fact, that has unearthed this fact, that is not to be here from this fact, and that is and if you hear this, that's also finding. And it's a very common, what you're pointing to is very common thing, the quote unquote flight of Brahmins from the village. I'm a product of that. My grandfather was totally like settled in the village, and by my generation, there's nobody left. So I would simply suggest that this is what social science tries to find out, and you're only strengthening, in my opinion, the argument for the caste census. I'm sure there are more nuances to this. We can talk about that later. Yes, am I questioning democracy? I hope everyone is. That we had it's the old usual thing that democracy is about right. So it's work in progress. All democracy always is work in progress. So I think that we have to maintain the relationship in our the way that it's working about. And there is a lot of pressure now, and we are all feeling that pressure in the context of election. In our context, it is the well-known, well-established, huge mismatch between vote share and speech share. You will have heard about the language. Now, Sociology in India is among the leading disciplines in the world. And you know all about swing voters, swing states, etc., etc. So this kind of a volatile relationship between how do you construct a majority and what does a majority mean? And perhaps most critically, what should a minority mean? Right? Because consider, I mean, a very simple, obviously, consider the two statistical facts. And please read the noted quotes. I have to put them for you every time. The group for Muslims in India is a minority, and the group for upper caste in India is a minority. How do you know these people? And the number of the decisive objective criteria that all minorities will be treated in a particular way. Not very so what I'm trying to say is that our ways of creating number and power have to be provisional, transparent, subject to debate. We can't jump to a magic solution that will satisfy all. There is no. But in our promise to this, we have to necessarily be devoid of ideology that are no longer useful. So simple majority is an idea that is too crude for our present day. And in general, once we start thinking about the relationship between number and power, I'm sure creative solutions will come up. They have to come up. That is what we have to believe. Um, I was waiting for resolution to come up. It always comes up there with this. I think the question of reservation is a way too narrow a frame to talk about the issues that I'm talking. Because it is locked into a zero-sum framework. And there are so many details that are not relevant to the larger argument that I'm making. But broadly speaking, the answer to your question is reservation is a particular kind of administrative device. The relationship between that administrative device and social justice is a contingent relationship. There are different types of administrative procedures and arrangements possible under the heading reservation. And we have to look at what is it that it is trying to address. Initially, it was trying to address the forced exclusion of large numbers of people from positions of privilege and power. Society left to itself would never allow, even if they were quote unquote qualified, or even if they had, in the market context, if they had the money, they would not be allowed to do what others with a similar qualification or similar amount are able to do. Or other than extra economic reasons, right? It is for those groups that we should have reservation. The answer to forced exclusion is forced inclusion. To exclude. That is what I was going to say. Even appears to my meaning is not only speaking about money, definitely because you are taking a method of excluding others, which are relatively involved, for a group who will not be excluded as a if they had the necessary economic support, they will make it. If other people want to them off. That's why scholarships for other economic needs, what I've always said, reservation to be replaced by economic program. That is what should have happened with PWS. So using the device of reservation there was not implemented. So these are the sorts of detailed issues that you get into when you get into the questions of reservation. But in fact, about it, larger issues are more, yes.
Good evening, sir. Thank you for your lecture. This question is, I'm a social scientist, so let me begin with that first. For example, you mentioned that the few are always powerful, and it is the masses who are always powerless in some sense. So don't you think that in that sense, that as a census is being conducted, census is being conducted by the government, which I assume is a few, for those who are powerless, for the masses. So given that proposition, don't you think that makes caste census a problematic exercise in some sense? Second, I have another question linked to this. Imagine if someone goes to a house in a rural setup and asks someone, what caste do you belong to? And we caste as low caste here. And the person hesitates to respond in that setup. So don't you think there are possibilities that it might lead to more fallacies in the caste census? Because a low caste person might not reveal the caste in that instance. So these are the two questions.
Okay.
After implementation of the caste census, is reservation the only practice of repetitions that we would offer, or are there anything else?
Yes.
Hello, Lisa. Thank you for your talk. And we just briefly touched upon that the caste is a part of modern India and how we see that caste is a part of every type of Indians and therefore the caste is a part of modern India. So in this sense, MS Pandey talked about how Indian modernity is equated with the Brahmin modernity, where we analyzed R.K. Narayan's life and his literature. And then he talked about how one state out of modernity is there, and the conception of modernity which today Ambedkar and area envisioned is different than Indian modernity. And like still many Ambedkarites don't see India as a modernized state, but they analyze the fact itself. So what's your take on? Thank you.
Okay,
Thank you for this. This is a slightly different track. It made me think about philosophy of numbers, something that I work on, and especially the connection between number and power. Right? I mean, on the one hand, there is this interdependency of these two concepts, majority and minority. They are interdependent, right? Without one, there is perhaps no other. So it's more of an interdependency than a very clear binary, perhaps. But as your talk made me think about Akadurai's work on fear of small numbers and the notion of minority construction from number, but at the same time, there is a shadow or a gap between the numerical concept and the sociological concept. So, if I heard you correctly, at one point when you were suggesting that we have to, of course, rethink the relation between number and power, which is subjective, but minority or majority for that matter are not numerical concepts for sociology, right? If I heard you correct, that was one of the assertions. Now, in the context of that assertion, are we talking about uncoupling number from power, or would that be too much of a move to make? Or are we going to relativize the relation between number and power? I don't know. I'm just interested in your expansion on this relation and what would you prescribe with at all, in the context, of course, of social justice and Caste Census and so on. Thank you.
yes. Okay, so let's, anybody else? Okay, I've been asked to answer these, then we'll come back to you. I'm assuming that those of you here now are not under threat of physical education. We don't have to leave, so then we can continue. Okay, the first question, where the few are always powerful. I did not say that the few are always powerful. I said that the exercise of power by the many, what I implied was that the exercise of power by the many has many complicated. So the question, see, we need to separate a instrumental efficiency type issue where ultimately a particular decision will be signed by one particular person. Since collectivities are abstract entities, the people that can't have breakfast with the people or they can't do that. This is an abstract concept, right? So when the president of India represents something, this is a device. It's a representational device that is we can separate that from the question of who really power. Okay? So in a technical sense, it may seem that power has to be wielded by the few. But the question really is, are the few, like the officials who sign documents and so on, what are they obeying? What larger structures are they obeying? That is the sort of question I'm asking. Right? So I did not say in that sense that the few are always powerful. That need not necessarily be true. In fact, one of the most difficult questions of modern policy is the problem of the fear of small number, but the problem of small numbers more very important. Because small numbers cannot muster the electoral muscle, electoral clout to get their demands addressed. Large numbers demand systems, sooner or later, their demands will be addressed because somebody will want their votes. This is what is the most dangerous and explosive thing that can happen in democracy. When you reach a stage where a politician can tell the minority of any kind, we don't need your votes. Once that happens, people will possibly be exactly what we were where we prepared this very famous report for states and minorities. Please read it. It's one of those forgotten documents, but it's everybody reads application of the past, but do read this document as well. States and minorities. It was sort of like a draft for the constitution, which got totally overshadowed by partition and so on. That's a long story. I won't get into that. And the question of people not revealing their caste and being embarrassed about it and so on. This is exactly the context where everyone is being asked. And in most concrete contexts, see, we project from our context in middle class society and so on, where we don't go around asking people their caste. But in most of society, people's caste is already known. And you don't even have to, in that sense, state that. So while you're right that caste is being asked and that can produce embarrassment, it can produce embarrassment if it is happening publicly. Right? If in this room I say everybody stand up and say your caste, yes, I can understand. But what is happening in the census area? Once your data goes there, it is anonymized. Right? So you're counted as a number, not as so and so belonging to such and such caste. And there are very strict laws against revealing de-anonymizing data. Officials can go to jail if that happens under the Census India Act. So this as an anonymized construct, I think it can be done and it is not subject to the public shaming type of thing that can happen in a setting which might be more public. Is reservation the only answer? No. See, the problem with reservation is that it is too little. The huge problem with reservation has sucked up so much of our discussion space and our sort of bandwidth or in terms of being with accuracy debate. The question of social justice is far larger question than reservation. So we need to think well beyond reservation. And especially today, when the formal sector, think of the absurdity of reservation at one level, where the formal sector amounts to a single-digit number, 8%. Right? Whereas everywhere else, there is a very different kind of reservation. A reservation based on caste, but the reverse kind of reservation, right? Where most recruitment in private industry to this day takes place by word of mouth, takes place by recommendations. Right? There are very few advertised jobs relative to all jobs. So reservation is very important for ideological reasons. It is necessary for those reasons. And it has had a very major impact as a builder of role models, as a builder of possibilities, as guiding aspiration and so on. But as a practical answer to caste inequalities, it is like that Hindi proverb, it's like "Oot ke muh mein jeera." It's a small, it's a speck compared to you're trying to drain an ocean with a mug and a bucket. Right? That it's not going to happen. So you need to think big. I didn't fully understand the question about modernity and so on that you said, that you articulated. Okay. there is a sense in which modernity was kind of preempted or occupied by Brahmins, and Pandit talks about that and so on. He also talks about how, when necessary, they can step out of it. It is not as though Brahmins gave up their caste, right? They learned to be Brahmin. I'm taking this particular caste as an example because it's what they are talking about Brahmin. But it's just an example. So it is just because they are the right in the powers to speak, they found ways to be their caste and be modern, right? And this way of doing it, it's tied up with the language of Indian nationalism as well, where some ways of being modern were approved and nationalist, and other ways of being modern were not. So contrast this, for example, with the well-known case of Chandrahan Prasad and the goddess English, or the controversial statement that from a Dalit point of view, the British came too late and left too soon. If they had stayed on for a while longer, we would have had more social justice here. Because you need a countervailing system of power to counteract your traditional entrenched systems of power and external. So these are about the contested terrain of modernity. Who is going to get called modern, and what would being called modern mean, right? So if, for example, if you are a young woman in the 1950s or 1940s, being called modern is a profoundly ambiguous thing. It can be a very negative thing, right? For that intersection. Woman and modernity is again a fraught thing. There's a lot of literature on this, you know this. So what I'm saying is that instead of thinking of this as some kind of equivalence or some kind of fully, it's like a physical space that once occupied when you occupy. This is contested terrain, and it is constantly like struggle as to who is modern and what does it mean to be modern and so on. And caste is fully tied up with this. The minority majority and the relationship between this. What I'm trying to get at here really is the ethical overlay or underlay, if you like, the ethical assess that the unthinking being from Rome will be from Rome. We despair that. The difficulty of thinking of the many as excellent is an art one. It's not an objective issue that somehow is clear in the number. And this is from the problem of finding the values of the number. Not the number or probably the best of. So what I'm trying to argue for is a self-conscious relationship or a self-consciousness about this attributed relationship between number and ethical value or charge that is attached to it in a particular context. And all of this actually context because there is no universal argument for it. And the dangers of simplistic ways of thinking are to philosophy of those that are the dangers of, say, majority or the dangers of thinking. There are the many of the few exert and undue amount of power, ethical leverage. And the reason why this ethical leverage works is because it is never named. It is always implicit. I think that we should start by naming this and talking about it. This is not in itself a solution, but it's a necessary step towards solution. Yes.
We know a lot about disability and like, until it is very recent that we have realized that in your different, there are very small women have read, for example, very study, like, people were talking about the aspects of the other. And it's a very recent movement. And at the same time, we have a lot of work about very food, very scholars, and it's really kind of the time we do. But at the same time, we have not had knowledge scholars coming to a lot of things. So what do you think the core of for us to really realize? Because this the core more who come from the community, because they are doing the thing. And they are also kind of visualizing to the work.
Yes, you're absolutely right, and it's a very special issue for our social science. And we do the personality asking that, that why is it take so long? And why is it so difficult to produce social scientific accounts of privilege? Now, there are problems with privilege studies as well. There's something called privilege studies that is now in the year 2000 about that. It's essentially right study. The framework of that, I'm very unhappy with it. It's very loose framework. But I think we can do far better. And I think that is the market. In my opinion, the work on class that needs to be done is the work on class studies. So that's it.
Okay, correct me if I'm wrong, the last table from behind. No, I don't know. So the caste census data from Bihar, one of the two highlighted rows in the table was of upper caste state, which I was differentiate. And
Yes.
and who had an amount compared to the other villages of all the representation data with other upper caste, so it's still something that. So when there is a last discourse of Pashmarga politics and how ruling parties are trying to take the narrative into their account. And there are even also conversations from scholars like Krishna and Kale, they recently bring out that the dangers of that. Using another statistical eye-open, can say that danger to equate the Muslim upper caste to the cultural privileges owned by the Hindu upper caste. So here the data also showed an anomaly. So I'm just curious, do we expect that a caste census can destabilize some sort of such narratives of some within the minority community over the society?
Yes, in fact, you're okay.
Yes, yes.
This, in fact, it's already happening with the debate on sub-regulation or sub-quotas. There are internal divisions, and the census has been collecting data on individual castes, individual castes, or individual tribes, for a long time now. But it has taken 2 decades for this question to come. These questions cannot be avoided. They have to be faced. And saying that this breaks the unity of the group and so on, I don't think is enough. And we have to find ways of maintaining unity while dealing with unity. That is the challenge. And it is a challenge that has to be taken. So far, these issues of internal divisions have been suppressed. That is the word in interaction. They have been suppressed. And it's a very good thing when suppressed inequalities get to be spoken about. In the immediate present, yes, it will make our life more difficult. Yes. But there's no way out without addressing it. And the last sentence of whatever we are doing, the time of this talk, is step forward in that way. We run towards politics. It will make life more difficult for sure.
Okay, now we have some online questions. Devani Parajare is asking, can caste census be used to make public spaces more inclusive from the perspective of social justice? If yes, does it interfere with the principle of secularism? And then I think, how is the caste census and its outcomes in the light of the recent sub-categorization to it? I think you just answered.
Yes. The subcategorization debate is a necessary and inevitable debate that has to be entered into. There will be many messy issues to be dealt with, but I don't think it can be avoided anymore. And the caste census is a useful step forward to enable addressing this, at least on the basis of some data. Although particularly for the scheduled caste, this is an old question because data has been available for some time. And the other question?
How does can caste census be used to make public spaces more inclusive from the perspective of social justice?
We put the caste census to understand that public spaces should be inclusive, and we can work to do that or not, independently of that. But the caste census does make things very stark. To put it very sort of bluntly, the numbers show you when you say the nation has to, or the nation wants to know. Right? You remember the and what the way between the composition of the nation and the these sorts of issues that they can bring up. To those who want to see, who don't want to listen. If you are determined not to listen, there is very little that social science or anything else can do to you. But the big hope is that this will create opportunity for pressure from below. In the end, it is pressure from below that produces lasting results. And we hope that this can be an instrument for that.
Okay, I think this conversation can go on forever because this is a topic on which it affects all of us at some level. So what I'll do is I'll end the formal conversation here, and I thank Professor Satish Deshpande once again for taking out time and coming and giving the wonderful talk. So please join me in giving him a huge round of applause for this wonderful. And we can carry forward this conversation over some tea. So before that, I would like to welcome all of you here to please come up here, and we can have a group photograph before we depart. It's part of our rituals of this campus. So we have to. So I'm trying not to move away from this, but thank you.
Sure.